I have a confession to make. I made a big mistake in part 1 of this series, and I said this. Catherine Eddowes once told the police that her name was Mary Ann Kelly, gave the police Mary Jane Kelly, the final canonical victim's, address when she got arrested for drunkenness. Now, while it's absolutely true that Catherine Eddowes told the police that her name was Mary Ann Kelly, I cannot seem to find where I got the address she gave the police was Mary Jane Kelly's address. So it seems that I got that information from my imagination, because the address Eddowes actually gave the police was 6 Fashion Street. So I thought I'd just let you know that I f***ed that up, because I'm not here to bullshit anyone. I'm not trying to sell you a book, I don't have an affiliate link to a Jack the Ripper book, and I don't have an online course about Jack the Ripper. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm just having a good time making videos about stories I find interesting, and I'm glad you guys are enjoying them. I'll also admit that I did briefly consider blaming Nelson Mandela for this error. Now, a lot of you guys asked why I said "God damn you Nelson Mandela" in the O.J. Simpson series. Well, it's because of the Mandela effect phenomenon, where people misremember things and then say, no, my memory is infallible, the only explanation I remember this thing wrong is because I've switched universes where things are now different. An example of a famous Mandela effect would be Darth Vader's famous quote, which some people remember going, "Luke, I am your father." Which is wrong, because he actually said, "No, I am your father." Another good example of this is the famous Forrest Gump quote, which some people remember as, "My mama always said, life is like a box of chocolates," which is also wrong, because he actually said, "Mama always said, life was like a box of chocolates." There's a small difference, is and was. Another good example is the name of the children's book The Berenstain Bears, being misremembered as being spelled with an extra A. And the best example is where it all started in the first place, that Nelson Mandela died while in prison. Now, as a South African, I can assure you that he did not die in prison. He spent 27 years on Robben Island, our own little Alcatraz, and then became our president. Point is, human memory is fallible, human perception is fallible, and human eyes are fallible. And so is the Mystorian. I gotta own my mistakes, and I made a big one. So, Catherine Eddowes did not give Mary Jane Kelly's address to the police. She told them 6 Fashion Street. So I thought, let me take a look on Google Maps to see where that would be. Wow. So I guess it wasn't a big mistake, just a 150-meter mistake. Or about 500 feet for my American friends. But it's still wrong, so sorry about that. Something else that I got wrong as well was the location that the Whitechapel murder victim Martha Tabram was found. This time though, I am gonna blame something, and I'm gonna blame it on the Wikipedia effect, because the coordinates that they have actually take you to the wrong place. But I'll talk about all of this again later. Okay, well, let's get started. My intros are just getting too long. I gotta stop f***ing around. Last time on The Mystorian, we briefly glossed over the so-called double event, the most likely fake Dear Boss letter, and the most likely fake Saucy Jackie postcard. Today, we're going to cover both of those murders in a little more detail, and I'm also going to get you up to speed with the Joseph Barnett theory that a lot of authors have been putting out there. And let me just say again for the record that I did not make this theory up, I am only covering it to see how it holds up. Anyway, let's get the show on the road. Viewer discretion is advised, and all of my sources are linked in the description. Let's start off today with the 5th Whitechapel murder victim and the 3rd canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Gustafsdottir on November 27, 1843, on a small farm near Stora Tumlahed, a rural village within the parish of Torslanda, west of Gothenburg, Sweden. Oh, there's going to be lots of big words today again. So sorry for all the wrong pronunciations again. She was the 2nd of 4 children born to a Swedish farmer named Gustav Eriksson and his wife, Beata Karlsdotter. When Elizabeth was about 16, she moved away from home into Gothenburg and worked as a domestic servant until she was about 20. Now, unlike the other Whitechapel victims, Elizabeth Stride became a prostitute much earlier in her life. The other ladies seemed to resort to prostitution because of poverty and after failed marriages. However, Gothenburg police records from 1865 show that Elizabeth Stride was arrested when she was about 21 because of prostitution. The year after, in 1866, she moved over to London. Now, her actual reason for moving is not known. She apparently gave different reasons as to why she did. Some say that she said she got a job working for a gentleman who lived near Hyde Park, and some say that she said she went there to visit family. She could have just moved there because she thought London was awesome. Either way, she presumably managed to move there with the 65 kroner that she inherited following the death of her mother in August 1864, which she received about the time that she moved. Now, nothing is really known about what she did for the first couple of years while she was living in London, other than she dated a policeman. But on March 7th, 1869, she got married to a guy named John Thomas Stride, who was a ship's carpenter from Sheerness and was about 22 years older than her. They lived in East India Dock Road for quite a while, and they ran a coffee shop together in Poplar, East London. Now, this being a difficult time to be alive and all, John Stride continued working as a carpenter to supplement their income. This does not seem to have supplemented their marriage, however, because by 1874, their marriage was starting to fall apart. Then in 1875, John Stride sold the coffee shop, likely due to financial hardship. Then in March 1877, Elizabeth was admitted to the Poplar workhouse, suggesting that the couple had separated by this time. However, it seems that they briefly got back together in 1881 and they lived together in the district of Bow, or Bow. Fuck, dude. Accents and pronunciations. This is going to be a long video. I'm just going to try to get through it quick, alright? But by the end of 1881, they seem to have permanently separated again, with Elizabeth Stride being admitted to a Whitechapel workhouse infirmary suffering from bronchitis at the end of that year. She was then discharged in early January 1882 and is believed to have taken up residence in one of the several common lodging houses on Flower and Dean Street. Now, Flower and Dean Street is basically Ripper Central. 2 years later, in October 1884, John Stride died of tuberculosis in the Poplar and Stepney Sick Asylum, on account of this being a difficult time to be alive and all. Now, weirdly, in the years following the death of John Stride, Elizabeth repeated a story to several people that her husband and 2 of her 9 children had drowned in the 1878 sinking of the Princess Alice in the River Thames. This is weird because she is not known to have had any children, but she told people that she and her husband had been employed on this steamer and she had survived the accident by climbing the ship's mast. But while climbing up there, she was kicked in the mouth by another survivor, and this injury to her palate had caused her permanent stutter. And this is also weird because, like I said, John Stride is recorded to have died of TB in the Poplar and Stepney Sick Asylum. Well, must be Nelson Mandela's fault, I suppose. Well, she continued to live in common lodging houses and occasionally received charitable assistance from the Church of Sweden, a nice little church in London. And from 1885 until her death, she lived on and off with a local dock labourer named Michael Kidney, who lived at Devonshire Street. Now, Elizabeth and Michael's relationship was a bigger disaster than the Alien Earth series that Disney just vomited out. Man, fuck. I used to say that Misty was a xenomorph because she's the universe's perfect killing machine, but now I'm just embarrassed to say that. Fucking hell, that show was bad. Anyway, Elizabeth and Mike Kidney regularly broke up and got back together, with Elizabeth sleeping in common lodging houses before going back to him. She even once filed a formal assault charge against him in April 1887, but then she didn't really pursue the charge in court, so the case was dismissed. But this is pretty much how the remainder of her relationship with Mike Kidney continued until 1888. Now, like most of the other Whitechapel victims, while surviving on her own, Stride made most of her money through prostitution and occasionally from sewing and house cleaning. Although she fought with Mike Kidney like diabetes and alcohol. Let me try that again without that stupid joke. Although she fought with Mike Kidney a lot, an acquaintance of Elizabeth's described her as having a calm temperament, but she seems to have acted a little differently while on the source. She appeared before the Thames Magistrate Court on 8 different occasions for both drunk and disorderly conduct, and the use of obscene language. Man, I'm glad I wasn't living in Whitechapel back then because I would have been hung for how much I swear. But the expression "swears like a sailor" exists for a reason. In case you didn't know, I am not an AI voice, I'm actually a real person and I used to work on cruise ships. And you should hear how the cruise ship employees swear in the crew areas. It's like fucking Hell's Kitchen back there. I once worked for a guy who swore at me for an hour straight. And surprisingly, out of my 8 years, that's one of my best memories because some of the shit he said was just hilarious. Fucking hell, historian, just get on with the story. Okay. The last time Elizabeth was at the magistrate court was on September 3rd, 1888, 1 month before her murder. Interestingly, Stride often used the alias Annie Fitzgerald at these hearings. Now, something that the authors who write about the Joseph Barnett theories have pointed out is the pattern of the victims' names. Now, even though it doesn't seem that Elizabeth Stride was actually a victim of Jack the Ripper, there's a little bit of evidence to suggest she might not have been. If she was, hypothetically, how in the blue hell would Twat the Ripper have known that Elizabeth Stride used this alias? The answer is quite clearly, fuck knows. You got me. Mary, Anne, Marianne, Elizabeth, Emma, these names are most likely recurring because they were just very common names. It is, however, an interesting observation. Like I said before, it could mean something or it could mean nothing. But hey, all that these authors are trying to do is trying to find something in this mystery to work with. In a mystery, by the way, that could only be compared to an empty Sudoku grid, or in fact, a Sudoku grid that looks like this. So I get it. All you can really do in this case is just grasp at straws. That said though, I do think there are some points made in the Barnett theory that are actually really good points. Not necessarily that he's the guy, just points that maybe need to be considered a little more. We'll get to it later. Moving on. Now, following an argument on September 26, 1888, Elizabeth and Mike Kidney separated once again. She then went over to the common lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street, and she told a fellow lodger named Catherine Lane that she and Mike Kidney had had a few words. Over the next few days, she earned money by cleaning, both at the lodging house and for local residents, and was observed by the housekeeper Elizabeth Tanner to be a quiet woman who occasionally performed cleaning work for the local Jewish community. Then, on September 29th, the day before her murder, Elizabeth Stride cleaned 2 rooms at a lodging house and was paid 6 pence, which is like £1 or £2 in today monies. That evening, Elizabeth was seen wearing a black jacket and skirt with a posy of a red rose in a spray of either maidenhair fern or asparagus leaves. Honestly, I don't know what I just said, but she was also wearing a black crepe bonnet. Then at 6:30 p.m., Elizabeth Stride and Elizabeth Tanner briefly visited the Queen's Head pub at the junction of Fashion and Commercial Streets, which on the map would be here. Then by 7 p.m., she had returned to the lodging house and was, according to fellow resident Charles Preston, Elizabeth looked dressed and ready to go out, despite it raining quite heavily outside. Now, according to Catherine Lane, Elizabeth had given her a large piece of green velvet as she left the lodging house at about 7:30 p.m., asking her to mind the garment until she returned. After this, there's a bunch of eyewitness accounts of Elizabeth Stride out and about and in the company of one or more acquaintances and or clients. A guy going by the name of Jay Best and his buddy John Gardner were certain that they saw Elizabeth Stride taking shelter in the doorway of the Bricklayer's Arms on Settle Street at about 11 p.m. Apparently, she was in the company of a man who was about 5 foot 5 inches tall. He had a black mustache, sandy eyelashes, and was wearing a black morning suit and a billycock hat. Another name for a billycock hat is a bowler hat. Now, according to Jay Best, quote, "They did not appear willing to go out. He was hugging and kissing her, and as he seemed a respectably dressed man, we were rather astonished at the way he was going on with the woman." Jay Best and his bud John Gardner then made a joke and said, quote, "Watch out, that's leather apron getting round you." After that, Elizabeth and this mystery man went off like a shot and they ran towards Commercial Road. A little later then, at about 11:45, a laborer who lived at number 64 Burner Street named William Marshall was standing outside his lodgings when he noticed a man and woman outside number 63. Nice and close to get a good look at this fucking guy. William Marshall described the man as being middle-aged and stout and had the appearance of a clerk. He was around 5 foot 6 inches tall, he was clean-shaven and respectably dressed. He wore a small black cutaway coat, dark trousers, and a round cap with a small sailor-like peak. According to William Marshall, Stride and this decently dressed individual were repeatedly kissing before the man had said to her, "You would say anything but your prayers." Then, at about 12:35 a.m., Constable William Smith was walking his beat along Burner Street and saw Stride with a man approximately 28 years old. He had a dark complexion and a small dark mustache. He was about 5 foot 7 inches tall, had a dark overcoat on, and a hard felt deerstalker hat. Oh no, that sounds a lot like the guy that was seen with Annie Chapman before her murder. Now, according to Constable William Smith, They were standing opposite the International Working Men's Educational Club, a predominantly Jewish social club which was located at 40 Berner Street. This man was apparently carrying a package about 18 inches long or about 45 centimeters long. However, having no reason to feel suspicious, Constable Smith continued on his beat in the direction of Commercial Road. No reason to be suspicious. None? You can't even think of one? Like, I don't know, you're in the middle of the worst neighborhood in Gotham City, Whitechapel, and there's a killer on the fucking loose. Killing prostitutes. Goddamn. Then, between 12:35 and 12:45 a.m., a dock worker named James Brown said he saw a woman that he believed to be Elizabeth Stride, and she was standing with her back against a wall at the corner of Berner Street and speaking with a man of average build in a long black coat. James Brown said he heard Elizabeth Stride say, "No, not tonight, some other night." Okay, so everything so far has been pretty strange, but what happened next is by far the strangest. But with all things in life, take it with salt. Lots and lots of salt. Now, according to a witness named Israel Schwartz, and according to my favorite website, jacktheripper.org, quote, "The most important witness to have seen Elizabeth Stride in the 30 minutes before her body was discovered in Dutfield's yard was a Hungarian Jew by the name of Israel Schwartz. He turned into Berner Street at about 12:45 a.m. and noticed a man walking ahead of him. This man then stopped to talk to a woman who was standing in the gateway of Dutfield's yard. Schwartz was later emphatic that the woman he had seen was Elizabeth Stride. Since it is likely that Israel Schwartz witnessed the early stages of Elizabeth Stride's murder and is therefore possibly the only person ever to have seen one of Jack the Ripper's victims in the act of being murdered, his statement is worth close scrutiny, albeit he spoke no English and therefore gave his evidence through an interpreter. This story pisses me off so much. It is also worth noting that his statement to the police and interviews he subsequently gave to journalists do differ in certain details. However, the police do seem to have taken him very seriously as a witness. Now, according to Schwartz, the man was about 5 foot 5 inches tall, aged around 30 with dark hair, a fair complexion, and a small brown mustache. He had a full face, broad shoulders, and appeared to be slightly intoxicated. As Schwartz watched, the man tried to pull the woman into the street, but then spun her around and threw her onto the footway, whereupon the woman screamed 3 times, but not very loudly. Israel Schwartz appears to have believed that he was witnessing a domestic attack, and so he crossed the road to avoid getting involved. As he did so, he saw a second man standing, lighting his pipe. As Schwartz passed him, the man who was attacking the woman called out, apparently to the second man, the word Lipsky, at which point the second man began to follow Israel Schwartz. Schwartz then panicked and began to run, and had managed to lose his apparent pursuer by the time he reached the nearby railway arch. Schwartz said that the second man was aged about 35, around 5'11", had a fresh complexion, light brown hair, and a brown mustache, and he was wearing a dark overcoat with an old black hard felt hat. Now, the presence of a second man is something of a mystery. It has suggested to some that the killer had an accomplice. End quote. Now, as I've already said in previous episodes, Elizabeth Stride is where things get complicated because it's hard to know for sure if she was killed by Jack the Ripper. The only 3 ladies in the story that people can, for the most part, agree were killed by the same guy is Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, and Catherine Eddowes. These 3 murders have the most in common, and with that being said, the description that Israel Schwartz has given of the attacker technically matches Joseph Barnett's physical description, but I need to add that I'm sure a lot of people match that description. Barnett didn't have a very distinctive appearance. He wasn't missing a leg or had 3 arms or something. Anyways, ending off with what jacktheripper.org says, quote, "Who was this second man? Well, the evidence seems to suggest that the police traced the second man and eliminated him as a suspect. Indeed, in a report dated October 19th, 1888, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson wrote that the police apparently do not suspect the second man, although we do not know why this should have been. Since her body was discovered at 1 a.m., Schwartz's sighting of her would mean that Elizabeth Stride was murdered between 12:45 and 1 a.m. For 2 violent attacks to have taken place on the same woman in the same gateway in the space of 15 minutes is too much of a coincidence. So there is a high probability that the man that Israel Schwartz saw was the man who killed Elizabeth Stride. End quote. I agree. There are so many fucking coincidences in the story that I'm honestly starting to lose my mind. And one more thing, what in the blue hell could Lipsky have possibly meant? No one's really sure, but people have speculated a couple different meanings. So after reading a dissertation on Casebook by Robert J. McLaughlin called Interpreting Lipsky, a few possibilities that he brings up is 1. The man shouting Lipsky could have, in mockery, shouted Lipsky as in I am going to Lipsky this woman, in reference to a Jewish man named Israel Lipsky. Jesus Christ, okay. Maybe everyone in Whitechapel does have the same name. Now, Israel Lipsky was hung for murdering a woman in 1887, 1 year before the Jack the Ripper killings began. The second possibility of Lipsky could have been the name of the second man across the road. However, nobody named Lipsky could ever be found. The third possibility is that it was used as an insult when addressing a Jewish person, and Schwartz had a strong Jewish appearance. Israel Schwartz was questioned at length by Inspector Frederick Aberline, but Schwartz could not say to whom the Lipsky remark was addressed. Inspector Aberline, though, believed it was directed at Schwartz. Now, as is tradition in all things Jack the Ripper, no one knows. Let it be a mystery. Moving on, at 1 a.m., a guy named Louis Dimschutz, who was the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club, came back to Dutfield's Yard from the West Tower Hill Market, where he spent the day hawking cheap jewelry. As he came into Dutfield's Yard, it was dark and he couldn't really see too much in front of him. At some point, his horse stopped pulling the cart and refused to go any further. Louis then looked down in front of the cart and saw a dark form lying on the ground close to the wall of the club. He then leaned out the cart and poked it with his whip handle and tried to move the object out of the way. When he realized that, hold up, wait a minute, this thing on the ground is kinda heavy, he lit a match to see what was down there. However, due to the wind and rain, the match went out almost immediately, but it made just enough light to see the body of a woman laying on the ground. Thinking that it might have been his wife, he quickly jumped off the cart and ran into the club by the side entrance and found his wife safe and sound inside. He then told a bunch of people inside the club, quote, "There is a woman lying in the yard, but I cannot say whether she is drunk or dead." Louis then grabbed a candle and took the people outside where they found the dead body of Elizabeth Stride. Some members of the group immediately ran and called the nearest constable, who was Edward Spooner, and they all quickly returned to Stride's body. Spooner then tilted her head back and saw that her throat had been slit. Dimschutz would later tell the press, quote, "I could see that her throat was fearfully cut. There was a great gash in it over 2 inches wide," end quote. Now Elizabeth was lying on her left side with her right hand on her stomach, and her left arm was extended behind her back. In her right hand, she was still holding onto a bunch of cashews. Cachows? Cashews. I don't know, but they were like throat lozenges or breath fresheners, which were still wrapped in some sort of tissue paper, and the bow of her checkered silk scarf had been pulled tightly to the left of her neck, possibly from behind. Blood was still flowing from the single knife wound to Stride's neck all the way down almost to the entrance of the club, and although her hands were cold to the touch, other sections of her body were either slightly or quite warm. Some clients of the club would later state that when they left at about 12:50 a.m., they didn't see anything strange. So that pretty much narrows down the time of death to somewhere between 12:50 a.m. and 1 a.m. Meanwhile, a guy named Maury Eagle and another client of the club ran to Commercial Street and found Constable Henry Lamb. Henry Lamb then alerted PC Edward Collins, and together they followed the 2 men back to Dutfield's Yard, where the crowd had now swelled to about 20 or 30 people. Henry Lamb then ordered the bystanders to keep back, lest they get blood on their clothing and find themselves in trouble. He then told Constable Collins to go at once for Dr. Frederick William Blackwell, who lived nearby in Commercial Street. He then sent Maury Eagle to the Lemon Street police station to summon further assistance. As these guys headed off, Lamb looked at all the blood and must have thought that there might still be a chance she was alive, and he felt Stride's face, finding that it was still slightly warm. However, when he felt her wrist, he could detect no sign of a pulse. When he was asked by the coroner at the subsequent inquest whether Stride's clothing had been disturbed, Lamb said no. I could scarcely see her boots. She looked like she had been quietly laid down. Dr. Blackwell then arrived at Dutfield's yard at about 1:16 a.m. and having pronounced the woman dead, gave it as his opinion that she had been dead for about 20 to 30 minutes. He also noticed that her scarf had been pulled tightly to the left, and at the inquest, he stated that he had formed the opinion that the killer had taken hold of her by grabbing her scarf and pulled the victim backwards onto the ground. However, he couldn't be certain whether her throat was cut while she was standing or after she had been thrown to the ground. Once the killer had cut through her throat, he sliced through her windpipe, and she wouldn't have been able to cry out for help, and she would have bled to death within 2 minutes. Now clearly, everybody got there pretty quick. They were quite certain that she had only been dead for about 20 to 30 minutes. So Constable Henry Lamb then gave the orders to close the gates into Dutfield's yard and told everybody to remain where they were. They then carried out a search of the club premises and examined people's hands and clothing for bloodstains. Having found nothing suspicious, the constables then went to the cottages behind Burner Street and woke the residents up to inspect them as well. All of them though had apparently been woken up by the constables and had no idea of what just happened in the last 30 minutes. When the residents got worried and asked Constable Lamb, what's going on, Constable Lamb just told them,
just hanging around.
Henry Lamb then must have at some point just given up because he returned to the body to find that Inspector West, Inspector Pinhorn, and Dr. George Baxter Phillips had arrived at the scene. Inspector Edmund Reed was also alerted by telegram at about 1:25 a.m., and he headed directly to Burner Street from the Commercial Street Police Station. When he arrived, Dr. Phillips and Dr. Blackwell were examining Elizabeth's throat. The police then went back to interrogating more people and they wrote their names and addresses down. Once everybody had given a satisfactory account of themselves and their movements, and their hands and pockets had been inspected and searched, they were all allowed to leave. A more thorough search was then made of the cottages and the names of the residents were also taken. At some point they came across a loft that was locked from the inside, and they thought that the killer may have been hiding inside there. But when the police forced it open, they found the loft empty. Now, I just want to mention quickly before we move on that around about now, the body of the 6th Whitechapel victim and 4th canonical Jack the Ripper victim, Catherine Eddowes, was found dead in Meters Square. We'll come back to her as soon as we finish Elizabeth Stride's story. Inspector Edmund Reed then lived up to his title and inspected the wall behind Elizabeth Stride for blood. However, no blood was found on the wall. Then at 4:30 a.m., they moved Elizabeth's body to the mortuary, and at 5 a.m., PC Albert Collins was ordered to wash the blood away from Dutfield's yard. Now, at the inquest into Elizabeth Stride's murder, by the way, it's been pointed out that I never explained what an inquest is. It's a formal judicial inquiry, often led by a coroner or public prosecutor, to ascertain the facts and circumstances surrounding an unnatural or violent death, or when the cause of death is unknown. Thank you, Google AI Overview. Now, at Elizabeth Stride's inquest, Coroner Wynne Edwin Baxter stated his belief that Stride had been attacked in a swift, sudden manner. The killer could have taken advantage of the checkered silk scarf that she was wearing to grab her from behind before slitting her throat. Coroner Baxter also thought that the absence of a shout for assistance and the lack of obvious marks of a struggle indicated that Elizabeth Stride may have willingly laid down on the ground before the wound had been inflicted. Since she was still holding a bunch of throat lozenges in her hand when she was discovered, that seemed to suggest that she had no time to defend herself and the attack had been sudden. The confusion there is that according to Israel Schwartz, this attack apparently started at 12:45 already. So does that mean that that person Israel Schwartz saw was not the person who killed Elizabeth Stride? As is tradition, as with all things Jack the Ripper, nobody knows. Now, Baxter also made the important observation that Elizabeth had been attacked in the passageway leading into a courtyard in which several families lived in cottages located a matter of yards from where her body was discovered, and that although this location afforded darkness, it was unlikely that the murderer would have selected this location of Dutfield's yard for being a quiet or unfrequented location. He also noted that the windows of the International Working Men's Educational Club had been open, and that both Elizabeth and her killer would undoubtedly have heard the patrons singing and dancing. Now, I'm not sure what he's getting at here, I could be wrong, But I feel like he's saying that if they assume this was the same killer that attacked Nichols and Chapman, that this guy is becoming more brazen and taking chances. Surely that's what he means, or if I just put my tinfoil hat on for a second, he could be hinting at his suspicion that Elizabeth Stride may have been specifically targeted, or that something happened that pissed off one of the people that she was with that night. I'm not sure. As is tradition, of course, with the Jack the Ripper mystery. Now, Baxter also said, yes, he said a lot of shit, I guess it was his job, but he also said that even though the witness descriptions are different, it does not discount the possibility that everyone saw the same guy. And then, following a short deliberation, they returned a unanimous verdict: willful murder against some person or persons unknown. Now, the biggest question, of course, is was this done by Twat the Ripper, or was this done by someone else entirely? No one can say for sure. The autopsy, though, does show some distinct deviations from the pattern, and therefore suggests that this murder might not be connected. Either that, or Jack the Ripper was interrupted. Maybe he was nearly caught in the act, or something spooked him and he took off after he was only able to slash her throat. Because, unlike the other two murders before, Nichols and Chapman's throats had been slashed by 2 deep cuts, their abdomens had been opened, disemboweling them, and in the case of Chapman, Jack even pulled out her entrails and threw them over her shoulder. And then for some fucking reason, he cut out chunks of her flesh and placed them above her shoulders. Elizabeth Stride, however, wasn't mutilated at all. Her only injury was a deep cut measuring 2.5 inches beneath her jaw, which had severed her left carotid artery and trachea. Now, Stride's murder was also the only one to take place south of Whitechapel Road, and the blade used was different. But since Stride fits the victim profile, and her murder occurred in the middle of this killing spree, her case was added to the Whitechapel files. Now, just 45 minutes after the discovery of Elizabeth Stride's body, a mere 17-minute walk away in a dark corner of Meter Square, the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered by Constable Edward Watkins. Now, if Annie Chapman's murder is where shit got weird, and Stride's is where shit got complicated, in my opinion, shit gets real interesting when you look into Catherine Eddowes. Now, just as a disclaimer, that might be because some of the information surrounding a murder has been embellished over the years. So as always, take the details with a grain of salt. I'll try to cover the points that I am aware of that are either wrong or misleading, like for example this fucking Eddowes Shawl that people say solved the Jack the Ripper mystery. Now, this story is 137 years old now, so some things are bound to be skewed. But anyway, let's go over the life and death of Catherine Eddowes. Catherine Eddowes was born in Graiseley Green, Wolverhampton on April 14, 1842. She was the 6th of 12 children born to tinplate worker George Eddowes, Catherine Evans, who worked as a cook. The family moved to London a year after Catherine's birth, where her father George got a job at a firm called Perkins & Sharpus in Belcourt within the city of London. Here, Catherine was educated at the St. John's Charity School in Potter's Field. Now, out of her 11 siblings, only 9 of them would survive to adulthood. Catherine's mother would also die of tuberculosis on November 17, 1855, at the age of 42, on account of, it being a difficult time to be alive and all. Then, in 1857, when Catherine was about 15 years old, her father George had died, resulting in her and 3 of her siblings being admitted as orphans to a Bermondsey workhouse, on account of it being a difficult time to be alive and all.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. All 4 Eddowes siblings admitted to this workhouse attended a local industrial school in efforts to teach them a trade. Through this initiative, one of Catherine's older sisters named Emma and an aunt of theirs secured employment for Catherine as a tinplate stamper at the Old Hall Works in Wolverhampton. She then moved over there, lived with her aunt, worked this job, and still tried to continue her education at the Dowgate Charity School. However, within just a couple of months of getting this job, Catherine was fired, possibly because she was caught stealing. But honestly, again, nobody knows the exact reason why. But the fact that Catherine lost this job is believed to have caused some tension between her and her aunt, because shortly after this, Catherine moved from Wolverhampton to Birmingham, where she briefly lived with an uncle of hers named Thomas Eddowes, who worked as a shoemaker. Catherine then got a job as a tray polisher, and after about 4 months, she quit this job and she moved back to Wolverhampton. Can't really blame her, that does sound like a pretty shit job, and she lived with her grandfather while back in Wolverhampton. and her grandfather organized a job for her where she would once again be a tin plate stamper. However, 9 months later, she once again moved back to Birmingham. While back in Birmingham again, Catherine began a relationship with a former soldier named Thomas Conway, who had served in the 18th Royal Irish Regiment and who received a small regiment pension. Catherine and Thomas would go on to have 2 children named Catherine Ann and Thomas Lawrence, and their family was supported mostly by Thomas when his health allowed him to work. Now, there's no evidence suggesting that the 2 of them actually got formally married, but soon after they started dating in about 1861 or 1862, Catherine began referring to herself as Kate Conway. She later even had Thomas's initials, TC, crudely tattooed in blue ink on her left forearm. So she clearly liked the guy, but it doesn't look like they actually got married. Then in 1868, Catherine and Thomas moved to London, taking lodgings in Westminster. About 5 years later in 1873, Catherine gave birth to their 3rd child. Now, while living here in London, Catherine apparently took to drinking, which started to cause problems within her immediate family. According to Catherine's daughter at her inquest, her parents began living on bad terms, largely because of her mother's drinking, which increased throughout the 1870s, and which her father, a teetotaler, found intolerable. Now, a teetotaler is someone who prefers to abstain from drinking alcohol. By the late 1870s, the fights between Catherine and Thomas are believed to have become violent, with Catherine occasionally being seen with black eyes and bruising on her face. By 1880, their eldest child had moved out and they were living with their 2 youngest children in Chelsea. Then sometime later that same year, Catherine left her quote-unquote husband and she moved to the East End of London. Now, the exact reason why she chose to relocate there is unknown, although by 1881, she was living with a new partner named John Kelly, a fruit salesman that she had met while they were both living at a common lodging house called Cooney's, located at 55 Flower and Dean Street, Ripper Central. After the 2 of them had started dating, she started referring to herself as Kate Kelly. Now, with regards to her drinking habits at this point, the deputy of this lodging house called Cooney's, named Frederick William Wilkinson, later stated that Catherine seldom drank to excess. Why are her drinking habits important? Well, I guess we'll see later. Now, at first, while she was living in and around Spitalfields, Catherine mostly earned her money by cleaning or sewing for the Jewish community, and it is believed that she also occasionally took to casual prostitution to pay her daily rent. Now, I guess they refer to it as casual prostitution because it seems like she didn't do it all that often. Sometimes, when she couldn't afford a bed in a common lodging house, she would try to borrow money from one of her sisters or even her daughter. Now, during September 1888, the final month of Catherine Eddowes' life, Catherine and John followed their annual practice of taking casual work hop-picking in the village of Hunton in Kent. Now, they must have assumed that they were going to be making a decent chunk of change there, because while on their way, Catherine bought a jacket from a pawn shop and John bought a pair of boots in a place called Maidstone. However, this year's hop-picking turned out to be quite shit and they didn't earn a lot of money, so they left early and returned to London on foot. Now, on their way home, they met a lady named Emily Burrell, who was a vagrant. Emily then gave Catherine a London pawnbroker's ticket for a man's flannel shirt, and she said that since Catherine and her man were going to London, and Emily and her man were going to Cheltenham, she basically had no use for this pawn ticket, so she gave it to Catherine Eddowes. Catherine then placed this ticket inside a small mustard tin that she carried around with her. Then on September 27, 1888, Catherine and John arrived back in London, and they spent the first night back in the casual ward at Shoe Lane. This would be within the city of London. And this, by the way, is the same day that the infamous Dear Boss letter was posted to the Central News Agency. The next night on September 28th, Catherine and John slept in separate lodging houses, with John sleeping at 52 Flower and Dean Street, their usual spot, and Catherine sleeping at the Mile End casual ward, where apparently she was well known, but she hadn't been back there for quite some time. Now, reportedly, upon her arrival at the casual ward, the casual ward superintendent asked Catherine where she had been lately. Catherine said that she had been in the country, quote, hopping, but I have come back to earn the reward offered for the apprehension of the Whitechapel murderer. I think I know him. The superintendent then said, mind he doesn't murder you too, to which Catherine replied, oh, no fear of that. Like I said before, there is no definitive source of this story, so it could be bullshit. Keep that in mind, a lot of these facts in this series can be bullshit. Then the next day, on September 29th, Catherine met back up with John at the Cooney's lodging house, telling him that there had been some trouble at the casual ward and she was turned out early. By the way, at this point now, just being back in London for 2 days, the two of them had spent almost all of their earnings from hopping. Now we're getting very close to the murder, so we're going to examine carefully what was noticed on the last day of her life. At 8 AM on September 29th, Catherine and John were seen together at Cooney's having breakfast. The deputy housekeeper of Cooney's, Frederick William Wilkinson, noticed that Catherine was wearing an apron. Now why does this matter? Well, aprons were associated with respectable working women and were often discouraged for prostitutes who were expected to dress more ostentatiously. Now just some quick tinfoil hat speculation here. If hypothetically Jack the Ripper is targeting prostitutes and he's walking down the road and he sees a lady wearing an apron, he might not have a reason to think that that woman was a prostitute. This will be something to think about when we find Catherine's body later. Now while Catherine and John were having breakfast, they were talking about ways to get money, and they agreed that they would pawn a pair of John's boots that he just bought at a broker. Catherine then went and she sold the boots and she got 6 shillings for that, and the ticket was in the name of Mary Jane Kelly. Now with the money, they bought tea, coffee, sugar, and some food. Then the two of them agreed to split their last 6 pence between them, John taking 4 pence to pay for a bed in a common lodging house, and Catherine took 2 pence. Just enough for her to stay another night at the Mile End casual ward. Then in the early afternoon of September 29th still, Catherine told John that she had planned to go over to Bermondsey to ask her daughter for some money, who at this point had been married to a gunmaker in Southwark for 3 years. Catherine and John then parted ways at about 2 PM that afternoon, with Catherine saying that she expected to be back by about 4 PM. Now it's not clear if Catherine did or did not go to George Lusk, who was running the Vigilance Committee offering the reward for the apprehension of the Whitechapel murderer, but it is not recorded if she actually did go. I would assume, based on the information we have about her final day, that she probably didn't go to George Lusk. The question is, why not? They were offering money and she said she knew who the killer was. Now, in my opinion, that suggests to me that she didn't actually know who Jack the Ripper was, and she was just saying what most of the people in Whitechapel at the time were saying, that they know who the Whitechapel killer is. The thing is, if she did go to George Lusk and she said, I think the killer is Joseph Barnett, who we know was a member of the Vigilance Committee, that makes a little more sense for what happens in a couple of hours. But again, let me make this clear. There is no evidence to support that, and that is full tinfoil hat speculation. Anyway, with the money they made from pawning John's boots, a barefooted John Kelly took a bed at the lodging house just after 8 PM, and according to the deputy keeper, he remained there all night. Then a little later that night at about 8:30 PM, Constable Lewis Robinson observed a small group of people gathering outside number 29 Aldgate Street. When he approached the crowd, he saw that Catherine Eddowes was lying drunk on the pavement. She was completely paralytic. Kaput, as my fellow crew members used to say. Constable Robinson then tries to lift Catherine to her feet and he leans her against the walls or the shutters of this house, but apparently she just fell back down onto the pavement. He then called for a couple other constables to help him and they took her into custody at the Bishopsgate police station to be detained until she was sober enough to leave. When she arrived at the police station, Catherine gave her name as Nothing, and within 20 minutes she had fallen asleep in her cell. Then shortly after midnight, in the early hours of September 30th, Catherine was awake and singing softly to herself in her cell. Constable George Hutt then heard this and went to check up on her. Catherine then asked him when she could be released, and Hutt replied, "When you are capable of taking care of yourself." She then said, "I can do that now." Catherine was then deemed sober enough to be released, and she gave her name and address to Hutt as Mary Ann Kelly of 6 Fashion Street. While Hutt escorted her to the door, Catherine asked what time it was. Hutt said, "Too late for you to get any more drink." Catherine then said, "I'll get a damn fine hiding when I get home." And Hutt said, "And serve you right. You have no right to get drunk." Damn. Hutt then walked her out the Bishopsgate police station, and Catherine turned to him and said, quote, "Alright, good night, old cock." What the fuck does that even mean? I don't know. Hutt then would also note that Catherine was still wearing her apron when she left the police station, And of course, we know why that is relevant. Anyway, while leaving, instead of turning right to take the shortest route to her lodging at Flower and Dean Street, Catherine instead turned left in the general direction of Meter Square. Then a little bit later at 1:35 a.m., 3 guys named Joseph Lawend, Joseph Hyam Levi, and Harry Harris leave the Imperial Club and start walking along Duke Street, the street touching Meter Square on the east. Then at the corner of Duke Street and Church Passage, they notice a man and a woman quietly talking. The woman had her back to them and she had her hand on the man's chest. These guys made it clear like it seemed that she had her chest there in a friendly manner and not in a protest. Neither of them appeared to be upset or fighting, and nothing out of the ordinary was going on. Now, Joseph Lawend was later able to determine that the woman they saw was definitely Catherine Eddowes, and they were able to tell that from what she was wearing. She was wearing a black bonnet and a black jacket. Lawend said the man that she was talking to was about 5'7" or 5'8", about 30 years old, medium build, fair complexion, fair mustache, and he was wearing a grey cloth cap with a peak, a loose salt and pepper coat, and a reddish neckerchief. To Joseph Lawend, this guy had the overall appearance of a sailor. Now, Lawend and the 2 other guys just walked past these 2 people and didn't look back. Then about 5 minutes later at 1:40 a.m., a police constable named Constable Harvey went down Duke Street and turned into this dark church passage and went all the way to Meter Square. He later said that although he didn't look into the square, he didn't see or hear anything suspicious. However, within the next 4 minutes, Twat the Ripper would kill and mutilate Catherine Eddowes. At 1:44 a.m., Constable Edward Watkins turned out of Leadenhall Street, went down Meter Street, and turned right into Meter Square. Almost immediately, he stumbled across the body of Catherine Eddowes. She was lying on her back in a pool of her own blood, with her clothes thrown up over her waist. Watkins then turned around and ran into the Kearley and Tongs warehouse, where he knew another retired policeman named George Morris, who was working there as a watchman. Constable Watkins then shouted, quote, "For God's sake, mate, come to assist me." Morris then asks him, "Oi, what's the matter, bruv?" And Watkins then shouts back, "Oh dear, there's another woman cut to pieces." George Morris then grabbed his lamp and followed Watkins to the square's southwest corner, took one look at the body, said, "Fuck in hell, mate," and then ran off blowing his whistle. Some other nearby police heard the whistle and started rushing to the scene. They all reported that they had not seen or heard anything out of the ordinary while on their beats. So thanks for trying, I guess. Then at 1:55 a.m., just 10 minutes after Catherine's body was discovered, a nearby doctor named Dr. Sequeira arrived at the scene. Man, these doctors are fast. At about 2:20 a.m., Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown had arrived at the scene as well to conduct the initial exam of Catherine Eddowes. His exam states, quote, "The body was on its back, the head turned to the left shoulder, the arms by the side of the body as if they had fallen there, both palms facing upwards, the fingers slightly bent. A thimble was lying off the finger on the right side, the clothes drawn up above the abdomen, the thighs were naked, the throat cut, across below the throat was a neckerchief. The intestines were drawn out to a large extent and placed over the right shoulder. They were smeared over with some feculent matter. A piece of about 2 feet was detached from the body and placed between the body and the left arm, apparently by design. The lobe and auricle of the right ear were cut obliquely through. There was an undefined quantity of clotted blood on the pavement on the left side of the neck, round the shoulder and upper part of the right arm, and fluid blood-colored serum which had flowed under the neck to the right shoulder, the pavement sloping in that direction. No blood on the skin of the abdomen or secretion of any kind on the thighs. No spurting of blood on the bricks or pavement around. No marks of blood below the middle of the body. There was no blood on the front of the clothes." End quote. Dr. Brown then goes on to note several horrific mutilations to her face and eyes that I can't talk about because I've got an eye thing. I can't read or watch things where shit happens to eyes. But Jack really went to fucking town on her face, man. I don't think I can even show a photo of her on YouTube because of how it looks. Now, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but to explain how it looks, the pictures of her kinda make her look like Sally from The Nightmare Before Christmas. Dr. Brown went on to say, quote, "The cause of death was hemorrhage from the left common carotid artery. The death was immediate and the mutilations were inflicted after death. There would not be much blood on the murderer." End quote. Very interesting. Now, a little bit later, they take the body to the mortuary where they start removing her clothes to examine her further, when the missing piece of her ear dropped out of the clothing. Now, if you recall, the Dear Boss letter said, quote,
"Next job I get, I'll cut the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you?"
That's again just how I imagine this fucking idiot sounded. Just in case you couldn't understand what I said, the Dear Boss letter said, quote, "The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you?" Now, we've already established that this letter was most likely a hoax perpetrated by a journalist who worked for a newspaper at the time called The Star, and the motive behind it was, of course, to sell more newspapers. But either Jack read this letter and wanted to confuse the police, or he could have just done it by coincidence. But the fact is, he did not take the ear and he did not send it to the police. He would, though, seemingly end up sending someone else something else. So one of the most important things to take away from Dr. Brown's notes is this. The peritoneal lining was cut through on the left side and the left kidney carefully taken out and removed. I believe the perpetrator of the act must have had considerable knowledge of the position of the organs in the abdominal cavity and the way of removing them. The parts removed would be of no use for any professional purpose. It required a great deal of knowledge to have removed the kidney and to know where it was placed. Such a knowledge might be possessed by one in the habit of cutting up animals. I think the perpetrator of this act had sufficient time. It would take at least 5 minutes. I believe it was the act of one person." End quote. So here we have another medical professional suggesting that Jack had some kind of anatomical, medical, or surgical knowledge. Dr. Baxter Phillips agreed with Brown, but not completely, saying the eviscerations upon Eddowes gave no evidence of anatomical knowledge in the sense that it evidenced the hand of a qualified surgeon, but the perpetrator may have held the degree of knowledge expected of a butcher or slaughterman. End quote. However, the police physician Thomas Bond disagreed with both of these doctors and stated in his report, quote, "In each case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer or any person accustomed to cut up dead animals." End quote. Dr. Sequeira, the first doctor at the crime scene, also agreed with Thomas Bond, saying the killer lacked anatomical skill and did not seek particular organs. Right, well, lots of interesting things to unpack here. Back in episode 2, I spoke about a guy named Charles Leachmere, and I asked if he was Jack the Ripper. Did he just kill Mary Ann Nichols and then go to work covered in blood? Well, evidently, it seems that whoever this killer was, he was somehow able to commit these murders without getting much blood on himself, his victims, or even the fucking ground. The next interesting thing to note is the neckerchief, because the dude who saw her last said the dude that she was with was wearing some kind of red neckerchief. Could this neckerchief have belonged to the killer? Well, that's very hard to say for sure, but based on this very real photograph of Catherine Eddowes, she is clearly wearing a neckerchief. Obviously, I'm just fucking joking, but here's a list of the things she was wearing at the time of her murder. As you can see here, I've highlighted one piece of red gauze silk worn as a neckerchief. So it appears as if she was also wearing a red neckerchief. Now here's the list of things that were in her possession. Now one of the two items I've highlighted is this pawn ticket that was given to her by Emily Birrell. As you can see, the name used on it is Jane Kelly of 6 Dorset Street. The other thing is a printed handbill, and according to a press report, a printed card for Frank Carter, 305 Bethnal Green Road. The reason these are highlighted is because once again, we have some astonishing coincidences. Jane Kelly of 6 Dorset Street, we already know why that's fucking weird, but Bethnal Green. Bethnal Green, as we know, is where Charles Leachmere stayed. However, his address was 22 Doveton Street, Bethnal Green. Still pretty weird, but as you can see from this list, there is no mention of a silkscreen printed shawl with a dark green background, brown edges, and a pattern of flowers on it. Now why is that relevant? Well, that is what I want to cover quickly. I'm sure at some point you've come across a video on YouTube that looked a little like this. Now this is supposedly because a policeman named Amos Simpson allegedly found a shawl by Catherine Eddowes' body and just fucking took it home with him. and the shawl just so happens to supposedly have the DNA of Jack the Ripper on it. And recently in 2014, a team of whoever's said they extracted and traced the mitochondrial DNA on the shawl to a guy named Aaron Kosminski. And therefore, they have solved the Jack the Ripper mystery. Now, as much as I wish this was true and we could say we solved the greatest unsolved mystery in history, it's just fucking bullshit. Reason 1, mitochondrial DNA doesn't work that way. There are people out there who can explain it much better than me, but let me just use a clip of mine from my Eddowes Family Murders video explaining mitochondrial DNA. So then what could the Japanese police tell from the DNA recovered at the scene? Well, not the killer's identity, unfortunately. He didn't match any other previous offenders, and he has never matched any since. But the following information was leaked against the police's wishes, but it turns out that it is at least true. Put simply, they determined that the killer was most likely mixed race, with East Asian and Mediterranean genes on his mother's side, but that is based on his mitochondrial DNA. Now, what is misunderstood about mitochondrial DNA is that it doesn't say exactly how far back those traces come from. So it could have been from his mother, or his grandmother, or it could have been from 480 years ago when the first Portuguese traders arrived in Japan in 1543. It is impossible to tell, so it's basically useless and cannot be used to determine how the guy actually looked. Now, this shit is also mentioned in every clickbait Jack the Ripper finally solved video, where people say mitochondrial DNA proves that Jack the Ripper is some guy named Aaron Kosminski because of a shawl that was never actually documented as found with Catherine Eddowes' body that apparently had Jack's DNA on it and was sold to some poor person with too much money. Well, probably couldn't have put it any better myself. However, there was quite a lot of hoopla around the shawl because the extracted mitochondrial DNA of the shawl matched female descendants of Catherine Eddowes. That's important, kind of proves that it's hers, right? And according to these whoever's, it also matched female descendants of Aaron Kosminski's sister. That's important because that's who they want to say the killer is. Now these guys said, quote, "The first strand of DNA showed a 99.2% match, as the analysis instrument could not determine the sequence of the missing 0.8% fragment of DNA. On testing the second strand, we achieved a perfect 100% match," end quote. Now the first question we have to ask is, where did the shawl come from? Have Scotland Yard just had it all this time? No, they did not have the shawl. A British author named Russell Edwards bought the shawl at an auction for £5,200. Russell states that Kosminski was on a list of police suspects, but there was never enough evidence to bring him to trial. Kosminski died at the age of 53 from gangrene of the leg in a London mental hospital in 1919. Now, Russell Edwards says that the DNA samples proved that Kosminski was definitely, categorically, and absolutely the person responsible for the Whitechapel murders, and absolutely is Jack the Ripper. I love the confidence. He told The Independent, quote, "I've got the only piece of forensic evidence in the whole history of the case. I've spent 14 years working on it, and we have definitively solved the mystery of who Jack the Ripper was. Only non-believers that want to perpetuate the myth will doubt. This is it now. We have unmasked him," end quote. Well, Professor Alec Jeffreys, the forensic scientist who invented DNA fingerprinting in 1984, initially commented that the find was, quote, "an interesting but remarkable claim that needs to be subjected to peer review, with detailed analysis of the provenance of the shawl and the nature of the claimed DNA match with the perpetrator's descendants and its power of discrimination," end quote. Professor Jeffreys and some others later stated that a claim presented in the book as a statistically significant match with the DNA from Eddowes' descendants, a sequence variation described as 314.1c and claimed to be rare, was the result of an error and mistaken for the common sequence variation 315.1c, which is present in more than 99% of people of European descent. The second reason this whole shawl thing is bullshit is there is no proof that the shawl came from Catherine Eddowes, Aaron Kosminski, the real Jack the Ripper, Hollywood superstar Shia LaBeouf, or if it was even found at the actual crime scene in the first place. Now the claim is that this shawl was found at the site of Catherine Eddowes' murder. Then Amos Simpson, the policeman, he took it home and it's just been passed down from generation to generation in the family. According to their family tradition, first recorded in 1988, 100 years after the murder, Amos Simpson obtained the shawl after discovering Catherine Eddowes' body. Okay. Apparently, the shawl's owner told Edward Russell that a London policeman, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson, who was on duty the night of Eddowes' death, asked if he could have it for his dressmaker wife. Understandably, Simpson's wife reacted in horror at the thought of using a bloodstained shawl. It was stowed safely away, never washed, and passed down from generation to generation, end quote. And then sold for £5,200.
Now, you talk about a good bullshit story. Holy shit.
Because we know that Constable Edward Watkins was the first person to find Catherine Eddowes' body. So how the fuck is this even possible? And why are police taking things from the crime scenes of murder victims? But let's just look at the implications here. Once again, let's go back to Casebook. A guy named Andrew L. Morrison lays it out very well, and I've linked the whole thing for you to read. But a Metro PD officer named Stephen White said that he and 2 other cops were staking out an alley just behind Whitechapel Road for 5 nights. When another cop comes shouting, "Hello, what's this? A body of a woman and a pool of blood was streaming along the gutter from her body." Constable White then hears this and tries to follow the other cop, but ends up losing him in the dark labyrinth of the East End mean streets. Now, there does not appear to be a Ripper murder that matches this description. Andrew Morrison, writing on Casebook, gives them the benefit of the doubt and says that it has a close resemblance to Catherine Eddowes, but me, a contrarian, thinks it sounds a little more similar to the description of Elizabeth Stride's crime scene, with of course her blood flowing down almost all the way to the entrance of the club. But for the Shawl thing to work, it needs to sound similar to Catherine Eddowes. Again, you can read the whole thing on Casebook for yourself, it's linked in the description. But basically, based on this account, perhaps this is when Amos Simpson got to the crime scene, but because of the 2 different police jurisdictions, he just grabbed Eddowes' shawl and left. Presumably because, there was beef between these 2 police jurisdictions. However, if this is true, the timeline of the Eddowes murder would look a little like this. At 1:30 a.m., Constable Watkins walks through Meter Square and sees nothing unusual. At 1:35, Joseph Lawend, Joseph Hyam Levi, and Harry Harris see a man and a woman, probably Catherine Eddowes, at Church Passage, which leads into Meter Square. At 1:40 a.m., Constable Harvey walks along Church Passage to the edge of Meter Square and sees nothing out of the ordinary. In the next few minutes after this, Jack the Ripper finds Catherine Eddowes, kills her, mutilates her, and makes his getaway. Then Amos Simpson comes around, finds Catherine Eddowes' body, takes the shawl, and leaves. At 1:45 a.m., Constable Watkins re-enters Meter Square and discovers Catherine Eddowes' body. The killer only had about 5 minutes to kill and mutilate Catherine Eddowes. If Simpson found the body before Watkins did, picked up Eddowes' shawl, and left again before Watkins returned to the square, this cuts down the time the killer could have had to do the mutilations. It is pushing credibility a bit too far to suggest that the killer just happened to pick the only 3 to 4 minutes in which he could kill Eddowes without being caught. The Ripper was lucky enough to avoid Watkins and Harvey, but now, if there was another policeman, then it was not just luck, it was a miracle. I agree with Andrew Morrison. In closing, Morrison says, quote, "The Simpson tradition could just be a story. The shawl could be from another murder site or could be any old shawl dipped in animal blood. There was a certain prestige to be gained by being the first officer at a scene of a murder, and several officers, including Walter Dew, claimed this honor in the case of Mary Kelly. Perhaps Simpson wanted to impress people and told his tale about finding Eddowes' body first. Who knows?" Exactly. Who knows? End quote. Well, I think that covers the shawl pretty nicely, and why Jack the Ripper is still pretty much unsolved. Alright, well, let's get this video back on track. Shortly after Catherine Eddowes was killed, the police were patrolling around, and at about 2:55 a.m., they found a bloodstained fragment of her apron at the bottom of a common stairway at a tenement building in Goulston Street. Now, before I dug a bit deeper into the Jack the Ripper mystery, this is what I originally thought the shawl was that all of these people were talking about. But nope, it's just some dude named Amos who stole it from a dead woman to give to his wife. Now, Goulston Street was about a 15-minute walk away from Meter Square and on a direct route to Flower and Dean Street, where Eddowes was living. Or in fact, where most of our Ripper victims were living. And some have suggested that her killer may have also lived nearby and headed in the direction of his home. Now, the section of apron that the police found was also contaminated with sections of feculent matter. Feculent matter, by the way, is poop. And the constable that found it was adamant that this apron had not been in the doorway when he had previously passed this location at 2:20 a.m. Now, interestingly, above where the apron was found, written on the wall in chalk, was the message, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Now, since anti-Semitic graffiti was common in Whitechapel at the time, it's unclear whether the graffiti was actually written by the murderer upon dropping the section of apron, or it was just already there where Jack the Ripper threw it, or it had been written afterwards. And although the City of London police believe the graffiti should have been photographed, Metro Police Commissioner Charles Warren came down, viewed the graffiti for himself, and then ordered that it be washed away before dawn. So the police never got around to photographing it, but the words, including all the grammatical errors, were copied before they were washed off the wall. That said though, 3 different police officers have all recalled it slightly differently anyway. Now, apparently the next thing that happened was Major Henry Smith, the acting commissioner of the city police, claimed in his memoirs that he discovered bloodied water in a public sink in a court off of Dorset Street. And as the water was slowly running out of the basin, he calculated that the Ripper had been there only moments before. However, as JackTheRipper.org points out, this is most likely bullshit. People have been able to determine that this is bullshit because no police reports, newspaper articles, or inquest evidence mention anything about bloody water flowing from a public drain anywhere that night, let alone in Dorset Street. Jack the Ripper author Martin Fido also said that he thought it was unlikely that the killer would wait to wash his hands in a semi-public place about 40 minutes after the murder. And it's been noted that Major Henry Smith's memoirs are both unreliable and embellished for dramatic effect. So what does this all mean? Well, we are slowly but surely coming to the realization that nobody really has a clear idea of what happened here in 1888. Not even the police themselves, because it's mostly the police making up the fucking details of this story. I don't really even know if we can rely on the details of the inquest, but let's cover Eddowes' inquest anyway. Her common-law husband John Kelly testified on the first day, and basically claimed that he was surprised that she was killed and didn't even know that she was a prostitute, saying that she was usually home by 9 or 10 p.m. Now, this could be because he didn't want to be charged with living off an unlawful earning, or maybe he really just didn't know. Eddowes is often referred to as a casual prostitute, most likely then only doing it when she really needed to. Oddly though, despite this, Catherine Eddowes still fits the victim profile perfectly. Catherine Eddowes was a prostitute in a specific age group using a specific name or alias, who had her throat slashed, she was mutilated and disemboweled and left with her dress raised above her waist. So is this just another coincidence? Or did Jack the Ripper somehow know that she would fit his profile because she was a prostitute? No idea, man. At the inquest, a bunch of other people would go on to testify about that night, like the police not seeing or hearing anything suspicious, and Catherine Eddowes' own daughter saying she basically kept her address secret from her mother because she was always coming to ask for money. In the end, the verdict of willful murder against some person unknown was reached. The police would go on to conduct a house-to-house search, but nothing suspicious or of use was ever discovered. Well, now speaking of character and the victims' profiles, let's take a quick look at what all of this looks like. Now, as I just mentioned, all of these ladies resorted to prostitution. All of them were in a similar age group, all of them to some sort of extent used the same kind of name or alias, all of them were down in their luck and had somewhat of a dependency on alcohol. All of them seemingly, with the exception of the final victim, Mary Jane Kelly. Now, since I'm covering the Joseph Barnett theory, and we're getting very close to the final victim, I think it's a good time to start speculating about the theory and start looking at a couple of the weird details. Now, once again, I want to make it clear, I did not come up with this theory, I just find it particularly interesting. I'm not writing a book about Joseph Barnett, and whether Barnett was Jack the Ripper or not is completely fucking irrelevant to me. I just find it particularly interesting because of the absolutely fucking ludicrous amount of coincidences. So if we may start speculating now and put the tinfoil hat on for a while, let's just take a look at some of the weird things here. Now, as I've mentioned, the victims had similar names, or were known one way or another to use a similar alias. Now, it is a stretch, I realize that. We've seen many people sharing similar names in this story, But while this tinfoil hat is still on, may I speculate that this might, just maybe, possibly imply that these murders were not actually random like some people suggest. If this is in fact just simply a massive fucking coincidence, then what's this? This is where all of the Whitechapel ladies were living at the time of their death, with most of them living there for quite some time. Now, I put a question mark next to Martha Tabram because I'm honestly not quite sure where she was living. There's quite a few addresses mentioned, but maybe the street names have changed because I can't seem to find them, or they just take me out of Whitechapel. Now let's use the yellow pins to show you where they died. As you can see, the crime scenes are pretty spread out. Wait, hold on just a fucking second. Do you see what I see? Jack the Ripper was trying to summon Bagagwa. I'm only kidding. That's a really wonky pentagram though. Now interestingly, I had this spot pinned for Martha Tabram, but it turns out that she was actually killed here, north of Whitechapel Road, like the other 3 confirmed Jack the Ripper victims. Now I do want to make something clear. I am not against the idea that this is all just a huge coincidence. It could be, but is it at least not worth looking at? There's nothing else to go on in this mystery, there is no evidence, and there's barely any clues. So looking at this map and the victims' profiles, there's some similarities that are quite obvious, as well as proximity. Not to mention the other coincidences mentioned before, like Annie Chapman maybe possibly holding a torn envelope that could have originally belonged to Mary Jane Kelly. And supposedly Catherine Eddowes said that she knew who Jack the Ripper was, and supposedly that person was Joseph Barnett, and then she gets murdered 2 days later. That could be just another coincidence. It could also be bullshit, could be false information. However, an obvious problem with that rumor, even if it is true, is why did she not go to the Vigilance Committee sooner? Or why is there no record of her doing that? That is an obvious problem that seems to have no satisfying answer, and in my opinion that means that she did not actually know who Jack the Ripper was. Again, I'm not trying to bullshit anyone here with these videos, and this Joe Barnett theory is not something I came up with. There are several books covering it, here's just 7 examples. I actually first heard it from Ryan Bagara when he covered it briefly on his BuzzFeed Unsolved episode, and then I found this dissertation from Dr. Frederick Walker. As I said in the beginning of episode 1, it's all circumstantial and would never be enough in a court of law, but I'm trying to go over it slowly to see how it holds up. Either way, I got one more thing I want to show you on the map. I'm going to add an extra pin here because sometimes when Catherine Eddowes didn't have enough money to pay for her lodgings, she stayed here. Perhaps you've got some keen eyes and saw what happened. If not, the drop shadow on the pin by Mary Jane Kelly got a little bit darker, because the extra pin is right on top of Mary Jane Kelly's, because Catherine Eddowes stayed right next door to Mary Jane Kelly in a room called The Shed at 26 Dorset Street. Now, even if Joe Barnett was not Jack the Ripper, is it not a reasonable assumption that the killer may have possibly lived somewhere around here? Jack heading down Goulston Street after Eddowes' murder also leads him straight into this area. Otherwise, we have to resign to the fact that all of these very similar people, living almost on top of each other, all got selected randomly and killed by someone who didn't even know them and lived somewhere else entirely. That could be the case, but this could also be a strong indication that the suspect lived here. And the only suspects that I'm aware of that lived around here is Joseph Barnett and a guy named Chaim Hyams. If there is anyone else that lived around here, please let me know, because I've been looking into suspects to see lived here, and all I can find is Barnett and Yum Yums, who is also portrayed to be quite a crazy motherfucker as well. But we'll talk about Yum Yum another time. But I don't know, man, I feel like this is the closest thing to a clue in this whole case. The victims all living in the same area here. Now, something else I'm not entirely against either is that these murders were committed by different killers. Attacks on women were common at the time. It's possible that only Nichols, Chapman, and Eddowes were murdered by Jack the Ripper, and the others were killed by somebody else. Mary Jane Kelly stands out a little in the pattern, but only because of her age, the extent of her mutilations, and the fact that she was killed indoors. Now, while speaking about Kelly and on the subject of the Barnett theory and his possible motive, which was trying to scare Mary Jane Kelly off of prostitution, it is a very elaborate idea and a really crazy accusation that when I first heard it, I thought, well, fuck, that sounds like something you'd hear a supervillain come up with. But let's indulge ourselves anyway with a bit of speculation. Let's say, hypothetically, you're a content creator and you're living here in Spitalfields. The content you create is unsolved mysteries. However, there are 1,200 other unsolved mystery content creators in Whitechapel at the same time, out of the estimated 80,000 people who live there. So that's about 1.5% of the population doing unsolved mysteries. It's not really that much. But then, all of a sudden, these other unsolved mystery content creators start slowly getting murdered. And after a few of them, you realize, hold up, wait a minute, these other victims all have or use a very similar name as me, and they lived within 2 blocks of me as well. Would you really not get a bit nervous at that point, or would you honestly say, it's just another coincidence? I can't say with absolute certainty that a fucking lunatic wouldn't have come up with a plan like that. Now, of course, the name thing again relies heavily on these ladies actually knowing one another, while there is a grand total of fuck and all proof that they did. Just because they all live close by to each other doesn't mean anything. But do you not know the names of at least some of your neighbors in a day and age where there is more to do in the comforts of your own home? If we look at photos from this time period, you can see how full the streets are with people. Do you think they're just standing there in silence or something, or is it possible that they may, from time to time, chat with other people? That is how Catherine Eddowes and John Kelly met. So if I may once again refer to my time working on cruise ships, which are like small floating cities, or neighborhoods really, when you don't have much to do in your tiny ass cabin, and you don't want to pay $5 for an hour of the world's worst internet, and you've got nothing else to do, most crew members go to the crew bar. After doing this for a couple of days, you start to make a bunch of new friends and acquaintances, and then you meet their friends, and eventually you know just about everybody. I don't see why that's not at least a possibility here. Ultimately though, for the Joseph Barnett theory, it's not necessarily pertinent that these ladies know one another. It's important that Mary Jane Kelly might have known them, and then by extension, Joseph Barnett could have possibly known them as well, which once again, there is no actual evidence of. Please understand that I do understand that. We're just speculating. So from Barnett's own mouth, he said that Mary Jane Kelly often allowed other prostitutes to use and sleep in their room that they shared. This is the very reason that they started fighting, and she eventually told him to fuck off. 9 days before she was killed, by the way, which is, I suppose, just another coincidence. Joseph Barnett said, quote, "Marie never went on the streets when she lived with me. She would never have gone wrong again, and I should have never left if it had not been for those prostitutes stopping in the house. She only let them in the house because she was good-hearted and did not like to refuse them shelter on cold, bitter nights." Barnett also admitted that they fought from time to time, which is not unusual for couples of course, but one argument in particular on October 30th got so bad that he admitted blows were exchanged, objects were thrown, and a window had been broken. According to jacktheripper.org, the cause of this particular argument and their subsequent separation was, according to Barnett, the fact that Mary had insisted on taking in a woman of immoral or bad character out of compassion, and Barnett objected to this and he left. He also said in his police statement, which was given to Inspector Frederick Aberline on the day of Kelly's murder, quote, "She told me that she obtained her livelihood as a prostitute for some considerable time before I took her from the streets." End quote. Interesting choice of words. He then said, quote, "In consequence of not earning sufficient money to give her and her resorting to prostitution, I resolved on leaving her, but I was friendly with her." End quote. This is again coming from Joseph Barnett's mouth. He told the inquest that Mary had on several occasions asked him to read to her about the Whitechapel murders, observing that she seemed afraid of someone, although she didn't express fear of any particular individual except when she rowed with him. Another interesting choice of words. Although he added, "We always came to terms quickly." End quote. Well, then after leaving her, as he put it, he went back to her every single day and would give her money if he had any. The last time he saw her, she was with another woman that he didn't know. They chatted for about an hour, and at some stage during this time, the other woman left. Barnett said that he left shortly after that, but before he went, he told Mary that he was very sorry that he had no work and was therefore unable to give her money. Now, unfortunately, figuring out what this guy was doing for work is a bit of a problem, and the facts have all been lost to history. Apparently, he worked occasionally as a construction worker after he lost his porter's license. but was technically still unemployed at the time of the Whitechapel murders. So it's hard to figure out where he was getting money from if he wasn't actually working or only working occasionally. Maybe he was pawning off his possessions, but then what was his endgame if he was just giving her all of his money, hoping that she takes him back in? But why? Because as he put it, he chose to leave her. So why was he going back to her every day to give her money? But is what this guy said supposed to make sense and sound normal? Hey, if it makes sense to you, fair enough. But if this was his attempt at trying to make up with her and move back in, it failed, because he was still living in a common lodging house when Mary Jane Kelly was murdered. Who knows? As people have been pointing out in the comments section, Barnett was questioned after Kelly's murder and cleared of suspicion, which is correct, you're not wrong. But a lot of innocent people get found guilty and wrongfully imprisoned, even today with modern forensic techniques. And many guilty people get away with murder as well. We're talking about a story from 1888. 100 years before DNA fingerprinting was invented. But, looking at Barnett's alibi for the night of Kelly's murder, he said that he was asleep in his common lodging house at the time that the doctors thought she died. Obviously, they determined this time of death by touching her skin with their fingers and guessing. I'm going to briefly cover the Mary Jane Kelly murder so that you kind of have an idea of why some of these people suspect Barnett. And I'll explain why he was cleared of suspicion. Now, Mary Jane Kelly's body was discovered through a broken window at about 10:45 a.m. on the morning of November 9th. Then the police only entered her room by breaking the door with a pickaxe at 1:30 p.m. and noted, quote, rigor mortis was setting in as they were examining the body. They also noted that there was a fire, quote, fierce enough to melt the solder between a kettle and its spout had burnt in the grate, apparently fueled with the woman's clothing, end quote. Now, it's not impossible that this fire's heat affected her body, even with a broken window. As we discussed in the Spy in the Bag video, the very, very strange death of Gareth Williams, decomposition can set in sooner in a warm temperature, and so can rigor mortis. Early stages of rigor mortis can start setting in anywhere between 1 to 2 hours after death, with full stiffening achieved within about 6 to 12 hours depending on the environmental conditions. Therefore, it is theoretically possible, based on the available information and the last witness sightings of Mary Jane Kelly at about 10 a.m., that she was murdered after 10 a.m. and not between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m. like the doctors guessed by touching her skin. The last person that she was seen with apparently was dressed as a market porter. The only person in the story that was a market porter was Joseph Barnett. However, the obvious problem now is that Joe Barnett was unemployed at this time. Now then, two questions come to mind. Did people in Victorian England wear mostly the same thing every day? The answer is yes. Unless you were quite wealthy, you would have worn mostly the same clothes every day. Were these clothes, though, provided for by the company that you worked for? As far as I can tell, no. So if Barnett lost his job, and one of the only outfits of clothing he had was his porter's outfit, then it could have been him talking to Kelly at 10 a.m. Of course, this goes without saying, but these witnesses could have been mistaken. There were only two people that claimed to have seen her after her presumed time of death. One of them, by the way, even spoke with her. So that was reason one of why he was cleared. It is his alibi and their presumed time of death, which could have been wrong. The other reason that he was cleared was because when the police examined his clothing for blood, they found nothing. I'd imagine that the killer would at least get something on himself, but according to the post-mortem of Catherine Eddowes, Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown did suggest that based on the way these ladies were killed, quote, the death was immediate and the mutilations were inflicted after death. There would not be much blood on the murderer, end quote. But yeah, Barnett was cleared of suspicion because he said he was asleep when they thought Kelly was killed and there was no blood on his clothes.
And yeah, that's really about it. So yeah.
In a day and age where solving a criminal investigation relied entirely on confessions, witness testimony, actually catching the motherfucker in the act, and finding direct physical evidence to link a person to a crime scene. So never mind the fact that they found Joseph Barnett's pipe on the mantelpiece over the fireplace when they found Mary Jane Kelly's dead body. Which right underneath, by the way, Jack the Ripper was throwing in all sorts of combustible materials to keep this fire going. But it makes sense the pipe was there, because Barnett used to live there, and he visited Mary Jane every day. Jack must have just been a bro and said, nah bruv, can't touch another man's pipe. Just another coincidence to add to the very big pile of coincidences, I guess. Well, to be an asshole and reword a quote from David McNabb again, the producer of the documentary on Charles Lechmere, quote, "The man who committed these crimes would have been a local. He would have been able to blend into the background and walk the streets without being detected. Barnett's pipe was found at the crime scene, but bizarrely, no one seemed to think that this was an important fact. I will at least admit that I am not totally convinced that Joe Barnett was Jack the Ripper. I would not bet my life on it, but personally, I don't think that it's crazy to be slightly suspicious of him, at least in regards to the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. I just think that it is weird that the murders seem to have started around the time that he lost his job and Mary Jane Kelly started working again, that all the victims lived very close to him, that he was on record complaining about prostitutes. None of the Ripper victims were actually sexually assaulted, possibly because he didn't like them. He admitted to hitting Kelly, and that when Kelly kicked him out, he kept going back to her, surely looking to reconcile, but she clearly didn't want to because he continued to live in a common lodging house. And then she gets turned into a Jackson Pollock painting, her murder being far worse than all of the other ladies. And then Jack the Ripper just stops.
And yeah, that's really about it. So yeah.
Because as the Barnett theory concludes, he no longer had a reason to kill. While I find that weird, I do also understand that other serial killers have also just stopped. Somebody pointed out in the comments that the BTK killer is a good example of one of those pieces of shit. And it's a good point. So Jack just stopping after Mary Jane Kelly's murder must just be another one of those coincidences that we keep coming across. Anyway guys, I think I'm going to call it here because I am absolutely exhausted. But I hope this at least brings you up to speed with the Joseph Barnett theory. And again, I want to repeat that I do not care who Jack the Ripper really was. I have no horse in this race, I don't have a book, and I don't have any affiliate links to a book that says Joseph Barnett is the Ripper. I just think that when you take a closer look at him in the context of the Whitechapel murders, it's fucking weird. At the very least, I think it should be considered that the killer may have lived somewhere around here in Spitalfields. Oh, and by the way, another mistake I made for some reason is I put WC on the envelope in my graphic for Annie Chapman, where Whitechapel and Spitalfields were actually neighboring districts and they were not inside one another. I have no idea why I did that, sorry about that, but hey, that's why I link all my sources, man, because I fuck things up sometimes. Anyway, next time we'll cover the infamous From Hell letter and the final canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, Mary Jane Kelly. Feel free as always to leave your thoughts and theories in the comment section, like the video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you back here for part 5 of Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders. Thanks for watching.